My name is David Martinez, and 6 months ago I was living a normal life as a construction foreman in Phoenix, Arizona, managing crews that built custom homes for wealthy clients in the desert suburbs. I had a steady job, a small apartment, and enough money to cover my bills with a little left over for weekend barbecues with friends. Then, one Tuesday morning in March, everything changed when police officers knocked on my door at 5 a.m. with an arrest warrant, charging me with armed robbery of a jewelry store that had been hit 3 weeks earlier. The robbery had taken place on a Friday night when 3 masked men had forced their way into Goldstein's fine jewelry just before closing time, terrorizing the elderly owner and his daughter while stealing over $200,000 worth of diamonds, watches, and custom pieces. One of the robbers had pistol-whipped the owner so severely that he spent 4 days in the hospital with a concussion and facial fractures. Security cameras had captured partial images of the perpetrators, but the masks and poor lighting made identification difficult. What made the case against me seem solid was that someone had called in an anonymous tip claiming they had seen me bragging about the robbery at the local bar, describing details about the crime that had never been released to the public. When police searched my apartment, they found $15,000 in cash hidden in my bedroom closet, money I couldn't adequately explain because it had come from under-the-table work I had been doing to avoid taxes. They also discovered that I owned a gun matching the caliber used in the robbery, though thousands of people in Arizona own similar weapons. My court-appointed lawyer was a tired-looking man in his 50s named Robert Chen, who handled dozens of cases simultaneously and clearly didn't have time to mount an aggressive defense for a client who couldn't afford to pay him. During our first meeting in the county jail where I was being held on $500,000 bail that I couldn't afford, Chen reviewed the evidence against me with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. The prosecution had circumstantial evidence that looked compelling to a jury. The anonymous tip that contained inside information about the crime, the unexplained cash in my possession, ownership of a weapon matching the one used in the robbery, and the fact that I had no solid alibi for the night in question since I had been home alone watching television. Chen explained that the district attorney was offering a plea deal of 12 years in prison if I admitted guilt to armed robbery and assault charges, but that going to trial could result in a sentence of 25 years to life if convicted on all counts. He strongly recommended taking the plea deal, arguing that the evidence against me was too strong for a jury to ignore and that my chances of acquittal were minimal. But I refused to plead guilty to crimes I hadn't committed, even though everyone from my family to my friends was urging me to take the deal and serve my time rather than risk spending the rest of my life in prison.
The trial began 4 months after my arrest in a courthouse packed with the victim's family, local media covering the high-profile jewelry store robbery, and curious spectators drawn by the sensational nature of the case. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Sarah Walsh, an ambitious woman in her 30s who had built a reputation on securing convictions in violent crime cases and was clearly viewing my case as another stepping stone in her political career. Walsh methodically presented the evidence against me, starting with the anonymous tip that had led to my arrest and the cash that had been found in my apartment. She brought in the jewelry store owner, Jacob Goldstein, who testified about the trauma his family had suffered and identified my gun as being similar to the weapon used by his attackers. She presented expert testimony about the security camera footage, arguing that my height and build were consistent with one of the robbers despite the poor image quality. During her opening statement, Walsh painted me as a violent criminal who had turned to violent crime to supplement his income and terrorized elderly victims for financial gain. She described the attack in graphic detail, emphasizing Mr. Goldstein's injuries and his daughter's ongoing psychological trauma from the experience. She argued that the anonymous tip had come from someone with direct knowledge of the crime, and that the cash in my possession was clearly proceeds from the robbery that I had been unable to spend without raising suspicion. My lawyer's defense strategy was minimal and uninspired, basically arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that reasonable doubt existed about my guilt. Chen called a few character witnesses who testified that I was generally a peaceful person who had never been involved in violent crime, but he made no effort to investigate alternative suspects or challenge the prosecution's timeline of events. He seemed to be going through the motions of providing a defense while privately believing I was probably guilty and should have taken the plea deal. The most damaging testimony came from Detective Frank Morrison, the lead investigator on the case, who had built what appeared to be an airtight case against me based on the anonymous tip and the evidence found in my apartment. Morrison was an experienced cop with a reputation for solving difficult cases, and his confident presentation of the evidence made a strong impression on the jury. He testified that the anonymous tipster had provided specific details about the robbery that could only have been known by someone directly involved in the crime or closely associated with the perpetrators. During cross-examination, Chen failed to challenge Morrison's investigation methods or question whether the detective had adequately explored other potential suspects. He didn't ask about the original anonymous tip or demand to know more about how the tipster had acquired their detailed knowledge of the crime. Most importantly, he never questioned whether the police had been too quick to focus on me as a suspect once the tip came in, potentially missing evidence that could have pointed to the real perpetrators. As the prosecution rested their case, I felt completely hopeless watching the jury's faces as they absorbed testimony that seemed to confirm my guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Walsh had presented a compelling narrative about a construction worker who had turned to violent crime to supplement his income, and the circumstantial evidence supported her theory perfectly. The anonymous tip, the unexplained cash, the matching weapon, and my lack of an alibi created a picture of guilt that seemed impossible to refute. But what nobody in that courtroom knew, including my own lawyer, was that I had been keeping a secret that could potentially save my life.
3 months before the robbery, I had been arrested for a minor bar fight and had spent the night in the county jail sharing a cell with a career criminal named Tommy Vega. Tommy was facing serious drug charges and was looking at 20 years in prison if convicted, so he was desperate to find information he could trade to prosecutors for a reduced sentence. During our brief time together, Tommy had pumped me for information about my life, my work, my finances, and my daily routine with the skill of someone who made a living extracting useful intelligence from fellow inmates. I had thought he was just making conversation to pass the time, but Tommy was actually gathering details he could use to frame me for crimes I had never committed. He had learned about my construction work, my address, my financial situation, and even my gun ownership through casual conversation that I never realized was actually an interrogation. After his release on bail, Tommy had used this information to set me up as the perfect fall guy for the jewelry store robbery that he and his associates were planning. The anonymous tip had come from Tommy himself, using details about my life that he had learned during our night in jail to make his information seem credible to police. He had even planted the cash in my apartment during a break-in that I had attributed to random burglary, taking nothing but leaving behind evidence that would incriminate me when the police came looking. But I had never told this story to my lawyer or anyone else because I had no proof that Tommy was involved in framing me, and I was afraid that accusing a known criminal without evidence would make me look desperate and guilty. The prosecutor said I had no alibi for the night of the robbery, his voice ringing with confidence as he addressed the jury during closing arguments. Mr. Martinez wants you to believe that he was innocently at home watching television while this violent crime was being committed, but he has no witnesses to corroborate this claim and no evidence to support his story. The circumstantial evidence clearly establishes his guilt, from the anonymous tip that led to his arrest to the stolen money found in his possession. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a case of mistaken identity or police incompetence. This is a case of a violent criminal who thought he could get away with terrorizing innocent people for money. He declared with theatrical passion, then, "Justice will be served today," as the jury looked on with expressions that suggested they had already made up their minds about my guilt. I sat quietly in my chair, watching Walsh build her case against me, knowing that everything she was saying sounded logical and convincing, even though it was completely wrong. The evidence against me was strong because it had been carefully planted by someone who understood exactly how to manipulate the criminal justice system to frame an innocent person. Tommy Vega had used his years of experience as a career criminal to create a perfect setup, using information I had innocently provided to make me look guilty of crimes he had committed. During the brief recess before closing arguments began, I made the desperate decision to tell my lawyer about Tommy Vega and the night we had spent in jail together 3 months before the robbery. Chen listened to my story with skepticism, arguing that it was too late in the trial to introduce new theories about alternative suspects and that my claims about being framed would sound like desperate lies to the jury. He insisted that our only hope was to emphasize reasonable doubt and hope that at least one juror would be unwilling to convict based on circumstantial evidence. But I refused to give up without fighting, so I demanded that Chen investigate Tommy Vega's whereabouts during the time of the robbery and subpoena jail records that would prove we had been cellmates. Chen was reluctant to pursue what he considered a hopeless strategy, but he was ethically obligated to follow his client's instructions regarding the defense strategy. During a lunch break, Chen's investigator managed to locate Tommy Vega and discovered that he had been arrested again just 2 days after my trial began on unrelated charges. More importantly, the investigator learned that Tommy had been bragging to other inmates about framing someone for a jewelry store robbery and had been trying to use the information about the case to negotiate a plea deal with prosecutors on his own charges. When my lawyer called Tommy as a surprise witness during the defense portion of the trial, the courtroom atmosphere changed dramatically. Tommy initially tried to deny any knowledge of the jewelry store robbery or my case, but under aggressive cross-examination, he eventually broke down and confessed to his role in framing me. He admitted that he had gathered information about me during our night in jail, that he and 2 associates had committed the robbery, and that he had planted the cash in my apartment and called in the anonymous tip to misdirect the police investigation. But when my lawyer called the final witness, Tommy Vega himself, the courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as he took the stand and began to tell the truth about what had really happened. Under oath, Tommy confessed that he had planned the entire frame-up from the beginning, using our brief time as cellmates to gather the information he needed to make me look guilty of his crimes. He described in detail how he had broken into my apartment to plant the stolen money, how he had made the anonymous tip using knowledge of my personal life to make his information seem credible to police, and how he had chosen me as the perfect fall guy because I was a working-class person without the resources to mount an effective defense. The prosecution objected frantically to Tommy's testimony, arguing that it was unreliable because he was a career criminal looking for a plea deal, but the judge allowed him to continue testifying about his direct knowledge of the crime. Tommy's confession was devastating to the prosecution's case because it explained every piece of evidence they had presented against me and provided a completely different narrative about who had actually committed the robbery and why an innocent person had been arrested. Walsh tried desperately during cross-examination to discredit Tommy's testimony, suggesting that he was lying to help me in exchange for some kind of benefit. But Tommy had nothing to gain from his confession and was actually facing additional charges for perjury and obstruction of justice by admitting his role in the frame-up. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with not guilty verdicts on all charges, completely convinced by Tommy's testimony that I had been the victim of an elaborate frame-up rather than the perpetrator of a violent crime. That conviction Walsh thought would advance her political career became her biggest embarrassment, as the media coverage focused on how an innocent man had nearly been sent to prison for life because of prosecutorial tunnel vision and inadequate defense representation. Today, Tommy Vega is serving 15 years in federal prison for the jewelry store robbery, evidence tampering, and conspiracy charges related to framing me for crimes I didn't commit. The real lesson of this story is that the criminal justice system can be manipulated by people who understand how to plant evidence and misdirect investigations, and that innocent people can be convicted based on compelling circumstantial evidence that was actually created by the real criminals. Sometimes the difference between life in prison and freedom comes down to one person's willingness to tell the truth, even when that truth incriminates them in serious crimes.